Hello and welcome back to the second part of the painting process for the diptych, I and us and you. In this video I am going to be talking about refining details and finishing the piece, along with some other things. Thank you for joining me, and please do all the YouTube things like, comment, subscribe. It's a huge boost of confidence to me and really pushes me to make more content like this. So thank you. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is detail work. I did the whole painting in layers, building them up so I can get drips after drips, and they kind of layer on each top of each other, and then going back in and adding the overall volume of the face, and layering with non-local colors. I approach doing the detail layers the same way, where I go in and I touch up small details, add things to the eyes, add little accents, let them dry, and then add another layer, then another layer. So when I'm building these layers of details, because I know it's in layers, I want to be a little bit tighter because I want that detail. I want to highlight, get the highlights of the eyes, or work on some hairs, or these small things that really make the portrait and the character of the sitter really come through. It adds that extra dimension that really just pushes what's there to the next level. But because I do work in a very loose style, I'm trying to retain some of that looseness. And so I'm still adding drips and still layering those elements that I have in that I use in the beginning of the piece. I also work on those in the detail layer. That kind of repetition adds a unity to the whole piece and really helps it be perceived as a united whole, especially in doing a diptych where it's two separate panels that are meant to be viewed as a singular piece. And so maintaining that same kind of consideration as I add detail was really important for me in this piece. So I'm not a painter. I don't think about painterly techniques or painterly strategies when doing these things. I instead rely on my artistic background and my intuition and experience in working in other mediums to execute things and have them work. So a lot of times when I'm painting, I don't have a finished idea of exactly what it's going to look like, because I don't go for a local color, and I'm trying to capture the character of the sitter and not necessarily a photorealistic interpretation of that person. There is a lot of room for me to just kind of let myself do what I feel looks good and not be constrained by, well, that's not what it looks like, or that's not the color. If I think it looks good, if I think that it captures the character of the story, I think that it improves the piece as a total, then those are the decisions I'm going to make. You know, capturing shapes of the ear, the right height of the eyelid over the eye, the small curvatures in the corners of the mouth, those kind of small details, getting those right really define the character of the sitter and help give you the expression so that when you see the final piece, it has the right tone. And those kind of things are true for any kind of work that's done with a figure or a portrait. It's those small details in the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the slight wrinkle of the forehead, the slight flare of the nostrils. Capturing those kind of details will translate to a reflection of the sitter's emotion. And this one, I wanted us to have a kind of acknowledging the viewer in the moment kind of thing. Like both of us have a slight upturn, a smile. We're both confronting the viewer. I wanted there to be the question of, is the viewer interrupting our conversation? Are we happy to see them? Are we slightly annoyed? I wanted there to be a little bit of question about the what's happening in this moment when you see these two. This is a good segue to talk about the conceptualization and the titling of the piece. As an artist, it's not just about making a thing that looks good. That is a part of the artistry that goes into making a work of art. The other part is the conceptualization, the intention of the piece, and being able to get that concept across to the viewer so that they can take part in the work in its totality and not be on the outside, while those with a better understanding of the arts or a better knowledge base can view the piece and understand that conceptualization. That's important for me, that my work is open to everybody to read, that there aren't parts that are gated by knowledge or experience. And so this piece was conceived as a diptych of me and my fiance, but I wanted to include the viewer in the work itself and make them the third part. So in my mind, it's not a diptych, it's a triptych. It's us and you, I and us and you, and that's really where the titling comes from. And I'm trying to use the titling as a way to inform the viewer that they are a part of the work, that they are integral to the work, because it's not just the people that you see, it's the viewer who sees them. So both of us are artists. And as artists, a lot of times it's our work that's seen and not us. Many people can look through my website, look through my portfolio, and they can get a sense of who I am for my work, but they wouldn't know who I am on site. Same thing with Joanna. She's an artist. People would know her work, but they might not know her. And so by doing portraits of us as works of art, I wanted to have us looking back at the viewer, just like the viewer looks at our work. And so when I was coming up with the concept, that was what was kind of going through my head, is this idea of us looking at the viewer, sharing in this artistic moment, sharing in this process, confronting the viewer with ourselves, and kind of saying like, hey, we aren't always behind the camera. We're not always, just at the easel painting or working. We're here too. We're part of the process, just like you're part of the process. And so once I kind of had that as a conceptualization for what I was doing, I thought more about how do I realize that in portraiture? So a lot of times you would think that a portrait, you just want to capture the likeness of the sitter, but a portrait is so much more than just the likeness of the sitter. It's about the character of the sitter. It's about capturing a greater totality than just features of that person. I really wanted to do that by making this more than just a pretty painting of myself and my fiance. I wanted it to be a work that had something to say. So I knew that there was going to be confrontation because we were going to be looking at the viewer, that kind of directness of gaze, but I didn't want it to be a head-on, we are always staring at you. Instead, I wanted it to be like we had just finished up a conversation and had turned to greet the viewer, or perhaps the viewer had interrupted us and we had turned to greet them. There's a slight smile on our faces because I wanted there to be the question of, is it because we're in the middle of a good conversation and we're enjoying ourselves and you've interrupted us, or is it because we've seen you and we're happy to see you and we're looking forward to you joining the conversation? And so that kind of dictated the pose, that three-quarter view. because I wanted it to be confrontational and inviting without it being a direct confrontation. Also, by having the three-quarter pose, it creates a triangle between me, her, and you, and once again creates that kind of inclusivity of the viewer into the piece itself. Some of the things that I did to try to amplify the expression and the mood of the piece is having one side of the face whited out by large amounts of light so that the right side of me and left side on her, there's no defined line that characterizes the edge of our features. It just fades into white. I really like that effect. I think it highlights and focuses everything on the sitter. And also adds a little bit of mystery because you can't see that definitive edge. I also ground the portrait on the bottom and the left side on me and right side on her so that they touch the edges of the panel, whereas our hairline just barely doesn't touch, and our face also doesn't touch on the other side, but they're close. That helps to add a bit of tension on the picture plane, just in the way that I framed the sitter. These kind of things are, basic art techniques that we see in like Mondrian's work, that way to add tension on the picture plane, and adding that bit of tension helps add some excitement to the piece itself. Like I said, I want this to be more than just a portrait. Should be more than just the features of a person. If that's all I wanted to, I would just take a picture, but it's a painting. There's more that goes into it, and there's more that you should get out of it. So by using some of these simple techniques, they help to make it more of a statement and add more interest and character to the sitter itself. Of course, another major element of these pieces are the drips, keeping those elements of randomness in the piece itself and actually encouraging them. Those are important just because both myself and Joanna, you know, we are not always in control of what we're doing. We both, have these times and periods where, we're very loose in some of the ways that we approach things in our art and our life, where we kind of go with the flow and let things just kind of happen. Joanna is a little bit tighter about the way she does things, and so I tried to maintain a little bit more control in her facial features, whereas I tried to push the dripping a little bit more in mine. Once again, it was more than just a way of working. It was a way of working that helped to highlight a little bit about the character of the sitter. It's definitely something that I think accentuates the portraiture and adds a layer of depth and interest that normally you wouldn't get. I think being able to see the artifact of the process in the final piece, by leaving these uncontrolled instances, it kind of shows an acceptance of the uncontrolled in the sitter. At least that was the idea behind utilizing this technique. I've also said before that I am very loose when it comes to working on things. And so, because I know this about me, I tend to lean into incorporating that part of the process into the things that I work with. It takes a lot more energy and effort for me to be very technically precise. And if I can just kind of intuitively go along with the process and flow with it and not have to clean up after myself as I go along, I find that to be a more enjoyable way of working. And so it worked out well that, a portrait of me and my fiance dovetailed nicely into the way that I'm working and the concept that I was working. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is refining. I kind of hate doing the refinement process on paintings. It's probably one of my least favorite parts, but it has to be done. And when I'm talking about refining, I'm talking about looking at my original source material and going back and making sure everything's still in the right place. As I'm painting, I'm obviously painting over my initial drawings and marks, and everything can start to kind of move out from where it originally was. The lines kind of get blurred, and then things get bigger. Good example is on my mouth. It doesn't cut in as much until I fix it. The slight curvature doesn't become a slight curve becomes a smile, or the slight shape of the brow ridge or the nose or the nostrils get kind of fudged as you layer these things, and you lose that initial marking of where things should be. So I have to go back in towards the end and double check everything, refine it all, and paint things down and cut things back so they all once again fit into the original proportions. It's a huge pain, and I wish I was a better painter, or a painter in general, and I could just get it right on the first go. But unfortunately, I still have to come back at the end and then do touch-ups, reduce the amount of shadow showing, increase the amount of highlights showing, and really the only way for me to do that is to come back at the end, because I need to step away from the piece so that I can come back and see where I've made those slight miscalculations and then correct them. When I started on the second part of this painting, I thought I was very close to being done. It'd probably be like another hour's worth of work, and it ended up being another 15 hours of detail and refinement. So, it shows how much work goes into this last little bit. If you look at the beginning painting to the end painting, a lot of it is just fiddly, small details, small refinements, moving things in, moving things over, and just fine-tuning everything. And that's such an important part of the portrait process, to make sure that things look right, so that the character is captured, and it looks like the person. You don't have, heaven forbid that you don't fall into the uncanny valley and you have something that almost looks like it should, but there's just that niggling feeling that something's off. And I had that feeling when I was looking at my self-portrait. And like I said, because the upper lip and the mouth, it was just slightly off for a majority of the piece. So one of the things that I use to help me make sure that everything's where it should be is, obviously I have an original grid that I use to enlarge, and I'll look at my gridded printout and kind of try to reline everything up to make sure that all the proportions are where they need to be. Another thing that I use is the camera. Actually going back and looking through the camera that I'm recording this on, or taking pictures of the work, because the viewfinder pushes you back much farther than I can get in my studio. And having that distance to look at the piece as if I was 20 or 30 feet away, it helps me, it changes my perspective so that I can see it in a different light, which lets me find slight flaws and things that need to be corrected. For the second part of the video, I started using a Canon Rebel T5, I believe, to do all the recordings. And this change in technology provided its own headaches, but it also allowed me to get a wider angle shot on the two portraits and get a better setup to actually view everything. And that let me kind of go back and look at the video once I was done shooting it. And in watching the video, I was able to pick out so many small details. And so using something like the recordings that I'm making helped me refine the work and help me produce a better quality piece than if I had just painted all the way through and hadn't taken that time to step back and taken that time to really make those decisions based on that information. So another piece of technology that I use when I paint is that I use a color reference on a computer or a phone as my reference instead of a printed photograph. One of the reasons why I do this is because I'm not going for local color. I'm not going for realistic color at all, but I'm going for a more vibrant, more saturated look in my painting, and a computer allows me to get an idea of what that should be without doing any kind of photo manipulation, simply because of the fact that it is a picture being projected with light. If I had printed it off, the colors would naturally have been less saturated unless I paid for a very good printing, which I'm not going to do for photo reference. Also, using a computer gives me the ability to zoom, so I can focus in on certain details at a greater level of zoom than I would on a photograph without printing it at that zoomed level. And I find that, that piece of technology as my reference gives me a greater level of control in executing the work than if I just use printed materials as a reference. And I think it's important that when you use something like a computer, you understand what that tool is bringing to the table, and how it's going to affect the final piece. And like I said, in this case, because I'm not going for local color and I want that kind of more vibrant effect, using the light screen, the computer or the phone, really did help me in executing the work so that it had a very kind of saturated, overexposed look, which I wanted. Another thing with the colors is when I started the piece, I used green because I knew I wanted green and purples. And so I made a conscious effort to try to focus on those colors in my non-local palette. I still use flesh tones, I still use reds, but having those greens as like kind of underpainting really helps to contrast and make those colors pop more. I wanted me to be more green and her to be more purple, just as kind of like a way to differentiate. So I focused more on cooler colors for her, with the purples in her face and the shadows, and more flesh tones and warmer colors in the light greens on my own self-portrait. And then the teal shirts were another way to get greens into the portraiture to kind of help repeat and fortify the greens that were already there without using that same kind of lime green that I used in the beginning. I like that bluish green. It also helps to unify the blue ink wash that I put on the piece and just add another layer of color that keeps it from being so drab, because it's a nice bright teal. I thought that was important to help keep the piece from getting too dark. Because, like I said, with the slight smile, I wanted it to have a little sense of play in the sitters themselves. And using a cooler color, purple or a darker green or something like that, I think would have been too dark and drawn away from the levity of the piece. As I work on the details and work on refining things, there's always going to be some point where you have to stop. You know, if I had kept pushing and kept working, kept working, kept working, I can lose a lot of those details that I've layered in that you can only see by getting close. And so you have to know when to stop working on something, otherwise you'll overwork it and things become muddy, they become less clear, less defined. And if you're not going for photorealism, it can be difficult to decide, to know when do you stop. You know, when is enough enough? Like I said earlier, when I started the second part, I kind of thought I was close to being finished, and it wasn't until I actually started working on it after stepping away from taking a break and then coming back to it that I realized that there was a lot of small details that needed to be worked in. I find that this is often the case when I'm working, that taking a break and coming back with a fresh perspective really helps me close in on a lot of that final 10% that needs to be done with 100% execution. That is to say that the finishing, the polishing and the detail work, that stuff that you do in the last 10% of your work, it cannot be shortchanged. You have to do all of it. Otherwise, the work suffers. In the same sense, like I said, overworking can make your work suffer. And so for this one, I really just kind of, once again, relied on my intuition of knowing when I was getting to the point that I was losing detail. And I think that is one of the harder things to learn, is when is something like this done? I think, yeah, it's about being happy with what I've made, and being happy that I don't see any of those uncanny things, any of those missing details, and that the character is where I want it in the portrait. You know, having Joanna there to ask her about the work helped. Getting another pair of eyes on the work always helps. Because even though they can't make aesthetic decisions for me, they can look at it and say, oh, you know, your lip looks funny, or what's wrong with this? And sometimes they can just naturally pick up on inconsistencies in the execution, or even proportional inconsistencies that can be fixed quite easily at this stage. But if you finish it, if you seal the work, it's not, you know, there's a lot more work to fix at that point. So once I was happy with the proportions, I was happy with the character, and I was happy that everything with the portraiture itself, the shape of the ears and all of those little details were in the piece itself. I went back and reevaluated the work, and I looked at what can I add, or do I need to add anything? And some of the final highlights I put in, and then more drips. I realized I wanted more of that element on the surface, and so I purposely went in and built up a lot more drips on both myself and Joanna to really highlight that as an intentional part of the process. And those were some of the final things that I decided to do on this. And then I sealed the work. I decided to use a satin urethane on top of the acrylic because I wanted something that would give it a slight sheen without it being glossy. I'm not a painter, so I went with the materials that I know the most about, which are urethanes. Something that I can put on top of the panel and would just seal it to kind of help hold those colors in. And I gotta say, I was really happy with how it turned out. I didn't really know what that would do to the panel or how it would affect the paint. It was the first time I had tried using that kind of technique on something like this, and I was really happy with the way that it turned out. The satin, I believe it was a satin urethane coat, semi-gloss. It was a semi-gloss. That semi-gloss on top really helped keep the colors vibrant, and I really liked that aspect of it. Just helped to keep some of the vibrancy and saturation of the colors on the panel, as opposed to how they kind of desaturate once they dry. So they have more of a fresh painted look, which I really liked. Thank you so much for watching the video. It means a lot to me that you would take an interest in my work. If you'd like to see more of my work, I can be found over on Instagram at Andrew Malczewski, where I upload far more images of what I'm working on a weekly basis. If you'd like to see more videos, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really does mean the world to me. And thank you.